In one sentence, Palpatine killed more Jedi than every Sith Lord in history combined. For 1,000 generations, the Sith waged open wars against the Jedi: the Great Hyperspace War, the Jedi Civil War, the New Sith Wars. Here, thousands of years of bloodshed, and the Jedi always endured. Then, Palpatine whispered 3 words into a hologram, and in a single afternoon, approximately 10,000 Jedi were reduced to maybe 100 scattered fugitives. No fleet engagements, no great battles, just a quiet command, and the people the Jedi trusted most turned their weapons around and fired. Order 66 is the single most devastating event in the history of Star Wars, and that is exactly the problem. It did more than eliminate the Jedi, it fundamentally reshaped the narrative architecture of Star Wars. It redefined the clones, diluted Darth Vader's mythic weight, compressed what was once the saga's most expansive era into a narrow cycle of repetition, and the franchise has never fully regained its former breadth. After reading through both Canon and Legends sources, what became clear is that Order 66 did not just break the Jedi Order, it broke the storytelling architecture of the franchise itself. The clones, the survivors, Vader, the Inquisitors, the entire Imperial era, all of it has been reshaped by a single event that was never meant to carry this much weight. Chapter 1: The Perfect Ending. There is a detail worth remembering. In the original trilogy, the destruction of the Jedi was never even called Order 66. When Obi-Wan tells Luke about the fall of the Jedi in A New Hope, he describes it simply: a young Jedi named Darth Vader helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. Nothing more. No mention of clones turning on their generals, no inhibitor chips, no grand military protocol, no number attached to the command. Just Vader, a betrayer, and the destruction he carried out. And that version of the story worked beautifully for decades. The destruction of the Jedi was backstory, a wound in the galaxy's past that gave the original trilogy its stakes and its dramatic foundation. Luke Skywalker was special because the Jedi were gone. Obi-Wan was meaningful because he was one of the last. Yoda mattered because his wisdom had nearly been extinguished. The absence of the Jedi is what gave those films their entire emotional structure. You did not need to see the massacre. You only needed to feel its aftermath. The weight of what had been lost was carried entirely by the silence of the people who survived it. For 20 years before the prequels existed, Star Wars audiences lived with that absence and never needed it filled. The destruction of the Jedi was powerful precisely because it was off-screen. It lived in the spaces between dialogue, in the weight of Obi-Wan's silence, in the careful way Yoda chose not to speak of what he had lost. The audience imagined the worst, and their imagination was always more devastating than any montage could be. When George Lucas wrote Revenge of the Sith, Order 66 was designed to fill in the details of that absence. It was a climax, not a premise. The culmination of everything the prequel trilogy had been building towards. 3 films worth of political corruption, Sith scheming, Jedi arrogance, and the slow erosion of a democratic republic, all collapsing into a single shattering sequence. The entire point was that the audience saw it coming, but the Jedi did not. That dramatic irony is what made it powerful. The way it played out in the film was deliberately cinematic. Critics and scholars have compared the Order 66 montage to the baptism scene in The Godfather, where Michael Corleone settles all family business while his nephew is being christened. Lucas himself acknowledged the Godfather homage in the Revenge of the Sith DVD commentary, specifically citing the parallel editing between Palpatine's Senate speech and Anakin's slaughter of the Separatist leaders on Mustafar. But the same technique of juxtaposing something sacred with something terrible runs through the entire climax, including Order 66. Palpatine calmly declares the Jedi traitors to the Senate while, one by one, across the galaxy, clone troopers gun down the people they had fought alongside for years. On Megiddo, Ki-Adi-Mundi is cut down in the snow. On Felucia, Aayla Secura is shot in the back. Above Cato Neimoidia, Plo Koon is blasted from the sky. The montage unfolds in near silence, as John Williams' score carries the emotional weight from world to world. And it works precisely because it does not linger. Early drafts of the screenplay actually included even more Jedi deaths. Characters like Barriss Offee, Luminara Unduli, and Shaak Ti were scripted to die in extended sequences. Lucas trimmed the montage down because the visceral effect came from the pattern, not the body count. You see enough to understand the scope, and your imagination fills in the rest. The restraint is what gives the sequence its devastating power. Lucas understood something instinctive about tragedy. The less you explain it, the more it resonates. He kept the montage brief. He kept it nearly silent. He let the music carry the weight while the camera moved from planet to planet, showing just enough for the audience to grasp the magnitude and then moving on. He trusted the audience to fill in the rest. That willingness to let the horror speak for itself without over-exploring or over-explaining is what made Order 66 the most devastating sequence in Star Wars. Lucas gave that imagination a form, and the form was extraordinary, but it was designed to be seen once, felt deeply, and then left behind, the way a wound is meant to scar over rather than be reopened. The prequels were always intended as the backstory to the original trilogy, not the foundation for a new era of storytelling. Order 66 was designed to close a chapter, not power a franchise. But that is exactly what happened. What was designed as a closed tragedy, a chapter that ended with the rise of the Empire and the exile of the Last Jedi, became something else entirely. It became a narrative engine, a starting point for dozens of new stories. And once a finished tragedy becomes an ongoing storytelling tool, the rules that made it powerful begin to break down. And the first thing to break was the soldiers who pulled the trigger. Chapter 2: The Moral Rewrite. The transformation of Order 66 from a closed tragedy into a living narrative began with what seemed like a simple problem, explaining how the clones could carry it out. Soldiers who had fought beside the Jedi for years, who called them General, who bled and died alongside them in the worst battles of the Clone Wars, were reimagined in order to account for how they could suddenly turn and execute those same leaders without hesitation. In Legends, the answer was unsettling but straightforward. The clones were soldiers, trained from birth to follow orders without question. All of them. The 150 contingency orders from the Grand Army of the Republic were drilled into every trooper during their development on Kamino. Order 66 was simply number 66 out of 150 protocols, covering every conceivable military emergency. Order 4 covered what to do if the Supreme Chancellor was incapacitated. Order 65, its immediate predecessor, actually authorized commanders to detain the Chancellor himself with lethal force if necessary if he was declared unfit to issue orders. The clones knew these orders. They memorized them the way a soldier memorizes rules of engagement, and the ones who carried out Order 66 did so because they were soldiers following what they believed to be a lawful command from the Supreme Commander of the Republic military. But it was not mind control, it was obedience. The most powerful example of what this meant in human terms comes from Karen Travis's Republic Commando novels. In Legends, some clone commandos who had formed families, who had developed relationships with Jedi, who had built identities beyond their serial numbers, looked at Order 66 and made a choice. Some chose duty, others chose loyalty to the people they loved. That moral fracture line ran through the entire army, and it was devastating precisely because it was a choice. It forced the hardest possible question. What do you do when your training and your conscience point in opposite directions? Canon changed the answer entirely. The Clone Wars animated series introduced the inhibitor chip, a small organic implant buried in the brain of every clone trooper during their development on Kamino. When Palpatine transmitted Order 66, the chip activated, overriding the clones' free will completely. They did not choose to kill their Jedi, they were forced to. This change was introduced through one of the most significant arcs in the Clone Wars series. ARC Trooper 5's discovered the chip conspiracy, removed his own implant, tried desperately to warn Captain Rex and Anakin Skywalker about what he had found, and was framed by Palpatine for an alleged assassination attempt. Fives was shot dead before the truth could reach anyone who might have acted on it. The tragedy of Fives is that he was right about everything, and he died for it. It remains one of the series' most devastating arcs. But the storytelling decision to recast the clones as bystanders to their own actions rather than complicit soldiers had consequences that reached far beyond that single storyline. The chip did something that might not have been intended. It removed the moral weight from Order 66 itself. Consider the difference. In Legends, Commander Cody, who had served with Obi-Wan Kenobi through some of the worst engagements of the war, gave the order to fire on Kenobi on Utapau because his training and his conditioning demanded it, even as part of him understood the magnitude of what he was doing. He was not evil, he was a soldier doing what soldiers are trained to do when the chain of command speaks. That is tragedy built on human failing, on the gap between what we know is right and what we have been conditioned to do. The chip erased that gap entirely. Under canon, Cody did not choose to betray Kenobi. He was neurologically hijacked. That makes him a victim, not a participant. And once the clones become victims, the moral architecture of Order 66 changes fundamentally. You cannot blame someone who had no choice. And if you cannot assign blame, the betrayal stops being a betrayal. It becomes an atrocity committed by technology, not by people. Consider why the original Order 66 montage in Revenge of the Sith carries such force. It is not just that the Jedi die, it is that the people who kill them are people the audience has come to know. Commander Bly shoots Aayla Secura in the back while she's leading them through the jungle. Commander Greed tries to decapitate Yoda from behind. The horror is in the relationship being destroyed. But if a chip made them do it, then the relationship was never truly tested. The soldiers were puppets, the Sith pull the strings, and the complex moral tragedy collapses into something simpler, a villain activating a weapon. That simplicity made the clones easier to redeem in later stories. Captain Rex could be fully absolved because his chip was removed. The audience could love him without moral reservation because he was never really responsible. That is narratively convenient, but it comes at a cost. Because the alternative, the version where Rex chose to fight his training and help Ahsoka of his own volition, where every trooper in the Grand Army had to face the consequences of his own decision, that version is harder to watch, harder to process, and far more powerful as storytelling. The chip also stripped the clones of their agency in the most defining moment of their existence. In Legends, the clones who carried out Order 66 had to live with that decision. That guilt was part of who they were. It was a scar they carried. Some were destroyed by it. Under canon, the chip took that reckoning away entirely. The clones were tools that were used and then discarded. Palpatine replaced them with recruited stormtroopers within a few years of the Empire's founding. The clones went from being the most important military force in the galaxy to obsolete hardware. That is a powerful story in its own right, but it is a story about victimhood, not about moral choice. The clones of canon are sympathetic. The clones of Legends were tragic. Those are different tonal registers, and the difference matters. The tragedy shifted from moral collapse to technological activation, a move that extended far beyond the clones themselves. It rippled outward, reshaping the structural logic of every Order 66 story that followed. Because once the purge stopped being final, people started walking away from it. Chapter 3: The Survivor Problem. In Revenge of the Sith, Order 66 appears absolute. The montage shows Jedi dying one after another across multiple worlds. The temple burns. Younglings were slaughtered. By the end of the film, the only confirmed survivors are Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, two Jedi in a galaxy of trillions. The message is clear. The Jedi are gone, and Palpatine won. Luke Skywalker's entire destiny depends on that emptiness. He's the last hope because there is no one else. But Star Wars kept finding reasons to add survivors, and every time it did, it chipped away at the weight of that emptiness. Ahsoka Tano survived because Rex fought his chip long enough for her to remove it. Cal Kestis survived because his master shielded him with his own body and gave the boy time to escape. Grogu was rescued from the burning Jedi Temple in a sequence not revealed until years after the Jedi Purge first appeared on screen. These are well-crafted stories. Each brings emotional depth and dramatic tension to the moment of the Purge. But the pattern did not stop with a few carefully chosen survivors. The number continued to grow. There are now at least 30 confirmed Order 66 survivors in canon alone. Legends had even more. Various sources have suggested that the number of Jedi who initially escaped the Purge may have been significantly higher than what the films implied. Mathematically, even 100 survivors out of 10,000 still means Order 66 killed over 99% of the Jedi. That is catastrophic by any measure, but storytelling does not operate on statistics, it operates on narrative weight, and that weight is shaped by what the audience sees, not what it calculates. When the audience knows that survivor after survivor made it through, the reality of Order 66 shifts. It stops feeling like an extinction event and starts feeling like a filter, a terrible, brutal filter, but one that its most marketable characters simply pass through. Canon said there were around 10,000 Jedi Knights defending the galaxy during the Clone Wars. If even 1% survived, that is 100 Force-sensitive warriors scattered across the stars. That is not extinction, that is a diaspora. And a diaspora tells very different kinds of stories than an extinction does. An extinction story is about absence, about what is lost and can never be recovered. A diaspora story is about persistence, about people carrying a culture, a tradition, a way of life into hostile territory and finding ways to keep it alive. Both are valid, but they are fundamentally different in their emotional architecture, and Star Wars was built on the first one. If there are 100 Jedi scattered across the stars, Luke's training on Dagobah becomes less of a singular, desperate act and more of one option among many. Yoda is no longer the only teacher left, he's merely the most famous one still breathing. The story still works, but its emotional exclusivity erodes. And emotional exclusivity was the entire foundation the original trilogy was built on. Once Order 66 survivors became a reliable source of new characters and new stories, the event itself became the center of gravity for Star Wars storytelling. Consider what has come out since 2014, when Lucasfilm reset the canon. Star Wars Rebels features a lead Jedi character who is an Order 66 survivor. Jedi Fallen Order and its sequel are built around a survivor. Obi-Wan Kenobi features a primary villain who survived the Temple Massacre. The Bad Batch spent 3 seasons navigating the immediate aftermath of Order 66. The Mandalorian introduced a survivor rescued from the Temple. Almost every major Star Wars story set during the Imperial era is tethered to Order 66. It has become the franchise's defining origin story, not just for the Empire, but for nearly every character who exists in this 20-year window. The Battle of Yavin gave Star Wars its calendar. Order 66 gave it its identity. And when a saga's identity is rooted in a single tragedy, the stories it can tell begin to narrow. Because every survivor who walks away from the Purge is not just a new character, they're a new demand on the continuity. They need a reason to survive, a story to fill the years that follow, and most critically, a reason they're not around when the original trilogy begins. That last requirement is the one that transforms survival from a dramatic opportunity into a structural limitation. Order 66 stops being an extinction event and becomes a character filter. Before examining where all these survivors ultimately fit, it's worth considering another consequence of their existence, because the survivors did not just multiply, they generated an entire class of antagonists built to hunt them. Chapter 4: The Inquisitor Machine. The Inquisitorius is, in concept, a brilliant premise. Former Jedi, captured by the Empire after Order 66, subjected to torture and dark side corruption until they became hunters who tracked down their own kind. Victims turn into the very weapon aimed at other victims. That is an inherently dramatic premise, and in some cases, it has produced genuinely compelling characters. But the structure of the stories built around them rarely varies. A Jedi survivor is hiding, an Inquisitor who is also a survivor hunts them. The survivor escapes or defeats the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor either dies or comes agonizingly close to redemption before dying anyway. And then the story moves on to the next survivor, the next Inquisitor, the next iteration of the same fundamental pattern. The rhythm is almost mechanical. Introduce a Jedi in hiding, establish that they have buried their connection to the Force, have the Empire detect them, usually because they could not resist using the Force to help someone. Deploy an Inquisitor with a spinning red lightsaber, stage a confrontation that tests the survivor's resolve. Resolve the confrontation with either escape or death. Reset, repeat. There are now at least 15 confirmed Inquisitors in canon. Each one was a former Jedi with their own backstory, their own fall from grace, their own connection to Order 66. Add them to the 30+ confirmed survivors, and you have over 50 characters whose entire identity is defined by the same event. Over 50 characters whose story begins with those same 3 words Palpatine whispered into a hologram. The Inquisitors exist because Order 66 survivors exist, and the survivors keep appearing because Star Wars needs characters with lightsabers in an era when the Jedi are supposed to be extinct. It is a cycle that feeds itself, and it has no natural endpoint. Every new survivor creates demand for a new threat. Every new Inquisitor validates the existence of more survivors. The supply chain of lightsaber content perpetuates itself, and each cycle of this loop carries the same emotional shape. The audience knows the survivor will probably escape because they have seen this pattern before. The audience knows the Inquisitor will probably die or be redeemed because that is how the pattern resolves. The stakes diminish not because the individual stories are poorly told, but because the architecture is visible from the opening scene. Once you recognize the template, the tension drains out of it. At some point, the question stops being avoidable. If there are this many survivors and this many hunters, can Order 66 really be the catastrophic, near-total extinction event it was originally presented as? Or has the constant revisiting quietly rewritten what Order 66 actually was? Because the more characters who survive it, and the more stories that hinge on escaping it, the less it resembles a genocide, and the more it resembles a dangerous job that a surprising number of people walked away from. There is a deeper structural issue here as well. The Inquisitor loop has not just repeated itself, it has crowded out other potential antagonists for the Imperial era. The Empire should be terrifying on its own terms. Grand Moffs, intelligence operatives, ISB agents, fleet commanders who crush resistance through bureaucratic efficiency and military power. These are the villains who make the Empire feel like a functioning authoritarian state rather than a backdrop for lightsaber fights. But when every story defaults to an Inquisitor as its primary threat, the Empire's most interesting qualities, its banality, its institutional cruelty, its ability to make ordinary people complicit in extraordinary evil, get pushed to the margins. Order 66 evolves from tragedy into a content engine, and if that is what has happened to the Purge itself, consider what it has done to the figure who was once its most fearsome avatar. Chapter 5: The Vader Delusion. In A New Hope, Obi-Wan's description is simple and terrifying. Vader helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He was the darkness that swept across the galaxy. The original trilogy presents Vader as the Empire's ultimate enforcer, a figure so feared that even seasoned Imperial officers flinch in his presence. His connection to the Jedi's destruction is personal, intimate, and total. He's the man who killed the Jedi. That is what makes him Darth Vader. Yet, as Star Wars expanded Order 66 into a detailed, multi-perspective event, Vader's direct role in the Purge has been increasingly shared and delegated. He led the assault on the Jedi Temple on the night of Order 66. He killed the younglings. He killed every Jedi still inside. That is a horrifying act. But after that single night, the actual ongoing work of hunting Jedi survivors was largely outsourced to the Inquisitorius. Palpatine assigned the Inquisitors to Vader as instruments of enforcement, and Vader uses them. He trains them, he disciplines them, he kills the ones who step out of line. But the day-to-day work of tracking down Jedi remnants across the galaxy, the grinding, unglamorous pursuit, that falls to the Inquisitors. Vader shows up for the major confrontations. He duels Ahsoka on Malachor, he cuts through rebels on the profundity above Scarif, but the systematic eradication is handled by subordinates. This makes logical sense. Vader is one man. The galaxy contains billions of star systems. He cannot be everywhere at once. But what makes logistical sense can still erode mythic weight. In the original trilogy, Vader's past feels like a one-man apocalypse. The audience imagines him stalking through the galaxy, lightsaber in hand, ending the Jedi one by one. In the expanded storytelling, that image becomes something closer to middle management. The Enforcer becomes an administrator, delegating the work of genocide to subordinates while he handles the occasional high-profile assignment. Vader went from being the man who destroyed the Jedi to the manager who oversaw the people who chased the people who escaped the event that was supposed to destroy the Jedi. Every layer of delegation adds distance between Vader and the mythic act that defines him. And that distance matters, because Vader's power in the original trilogy is not just physical, it is narrative. He carries the weight of everything that happened before Luke's story begins. The less of that weight he actually bears, the less he means when he walks into a room. The Inquisitorius solved a logistical problem. The galaxy is too big for one man to police, but in solving that problem, it inadvertently created a narrative one. Vader's legend depends on the sense that the Jedi's destruction was personal. Every intermediary, every delegation, every Inquisitor sent in his place chips away at that sense, and once you start distributing Vader's mythic function across a dozen subordinates, the myth itself begins to thin. There is a reason the hallway scene at the end of Rogue One became one of the most beloved moments in modern Star Wars. It works because, for 2 minutes, Vader is exactly what the original trilogy implied he always was: a singular, unstoppable force of destruction. No Inquisitors, no delegation, just Vader, a lightsaber, and the people unlucky enough to be standing between him and his objective. The audience responded to that scene with a fervor that reveals something important. They had been hungry for that version of Vader who does the work himself. The mythic Vader, the one who does not delegate destruction. The intensity of that reaction is, in itself, a measure of how much the expanded storytelling had diluted the very quality that made Vader iconic. The audience did not need to be told what Vader was. They needed to be shown, and for 2 minutes, they were. Order 66 doesn't just dilute the Jedi, it dilutes Vader. This erosion of Vader's singular role is part of a larger pressure that Order 66 created. A pressure that has less to do with any individual character and everything to do with the constraints of the timeline itself. Chapter 6: The Timeline Trap. Every Order 66 survivor is on a clock. The audience knows it from the moment they are introduced. The problem is structural. The original trilogy establishes a galaxy in which the Jedi are functionally extinct. Luke Skywalker is described as the last hope. Obi-Wan and Yoda are the only known survivors, and both are in hiding. For any story set between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope to function within this continuity, every Jedi survivor introduced must be accounted for before the original trilogy begins. They have to die, disappear, or be rendered so thoroughly irrelevant that their absence from the rebellion requires no explanation. This creates a peculiar kind of dramatic tension. The audience cares about these characters, invests in their journeys, and watches as the story finds increasingly creative ways to remove them from the galactic chessboard before the pieces have to match the positions established in 1977. It is storytelling with an expiration date built into every character arc, and the more survivors are introduced, the more exits have to be engineered, and the more elaborate those exits become. Some characters are killed by Vader, some vanish into unexplored regions of space, some are transported through mystical portals, some simply drift into lives so far removed from the central conflict that their absence becomes plausible. Each exit is creative, each works on its own terms, but the pattern is unmistakable, and the audience recognizes it. You cannot surprise an audience with a character's departure when they've been expecting it since the first scene. The exits become less about the character's journey and more about the franchise resolving a continuity problem, accounting for every piece before the original trilogy reasserts its established authority. The cumulative effect is a kind of dramatic claustrophobia. The 20-year gap between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope should feel like a vast, unexplored era. 2 decades of galactic history, entire civilizations rising and falling under Imperial rule. But because so many stories are anchored to Order 66 and its immediate aftermath, the era feels smaller than it should. It feels like a waiting room. Every character is simply marking time until the original trilogy begins. The dramatic irony that made the prequels powerful, the audience knowing what was coming, has become a structural constraint that limits what new stories can accomplish. And that waiting room has started to feel crowded. With this many survivors, this many Inquisitors, and this many stories all occupying the same dramatic space, the Dark Times have become one of the most densely populated eras in Star Wars history, which is exactly the opposite of what Order 66 was supposed to create. The Purge was meant to empty the galaxy of Jedi. Instead, it filled the galaxy with stories about Jedi. The compression is not just temporal, it is thematic as well. Stories set in this era share not only a time period, but an emotional register: loss, hiding, survival, pursuit. The trauma of the Purge saturates every narrative that touches it, which means the Imperial era has developed a tonal sameness that belies its enormous scope. 20 years of galactic history reduced to variations on the same melody. The galaxy under the Empire should feel vast and varied. The way life under any authoritarian regime varies wildly depending on where you stand and what you've lost. Instead, it feels like a single long exhale after Order 66, a sustained, unresolved note of grief that never resolves into something new. The irony is that the era's most powerful storytelling potential has almost nothing to do with the Jedi at all. What does the Empire look like on a farming world in the Outer Rim where no Jedi has set foot in centuries? What happens inside the Imperial bureaucracy when an ambitious officer discovers the regime he serves is built on lies? What does organized crime look like when the Republic's law enforcement infrastructure collapses overnight? These are stories the galaxy has always had room for, and that remain largely untold. The 20-year era shrinks under continuity pressure, and at least one major piece of Star Wars storytelling has proven those untold stories can work. Chapter 7: Proof It Can Move On. Andor is set in the same oppressive period as every other Imperial-era Star Wars story. It deals with the Empire's stranglehold on the galaxy, the birth of the Rebel Alliance, and the staggering personal costs of resistance. But it does so without a single lightsaber igniting. No Jedi survivors running from Inquisitors, no flashbacks to the temple burning, no clones wrestling with their chips. The Force is referenced only in the most passing, abstract terms, if at all. The story is about people, ordinary people facing an extraordinary evil, without the safety net of a mystical order to protect them. And it is widely considered one of the best Star Wars stories ever told. When there are no Jedi to save the day, the stakes for ordinary people become real and immediate and permanent. Luthen Rael is compelling not because he channels the Force, but because he's an ordinary man making impossible choices about who lives and who dies in the name of a rebellion he may not live to see succeed. The tension in Andor comes from the vulnerability of its characters, not from the legacy of a purge that happened years before. Andor proved that Star Wars can tell Imperial-era stories without orbiting Order 66, but it also exposed, by contrast, just how dependent the rest of the saga has become on that orbit. Some fans initially pushed back against Andor for not feeling like Star Wars enough. No lightsabers, no Force battles, no familiar iconography of the Jedi. And that reaction, the instinct that Star Wars requires Jedi to feel like itself, is exactly the pressure that keeps Order 66 at the center of everything. Star Wars has conditioned its audience to expect Force users in every story, and Order 66 is the mechanism that generates those Force users. The Purge's aftermath has become the franchise's most reliable source of lightsaber-wielding characters in an era where lightsabers are supposed to be extinct. What Andor demonstrated is that the absence of Jedi does not create a void, it creates space. Space for stories about prison breaks and corporate espionage and the moral compromises of revolution. Space for characters who carry blasters instead of lightsabers and whose courage comes from conviction rather than midichlorians. Space for a galaxy that feels lived in rather than haunted. The High Republic Publishing Initiative proved the same principle from the opposite direction. By pushing the timeline back 200 years before the prequels, with no Purge to reference, no survivors to track, and no Inquisitors to deploy, the High Republic was free to tell stories about the Jedi at the height of their power, facing entirely new threats. The Nihil, the Nameless, the slow realization that the galaxy's guardians were not as invulnerable as they believed. Those stories felt fresh in a way that another Order 66 flashback never could. They demonstrated that the Jedi are most compelling when the Purge is not part of the equation. The galaxy is vast enough for both kinds of stories, those that involve the Force and those that do not. But one kind has been crowding out the other for a decade, and Order 66 is the reason why. The closed loop described earlier, survivors generating hunters, hunters generating confrontations, Confrontations generating demand for more survivors has become the franchise's default content pipeline. Breaking out of it requires a deliberate creative choice to tell stories that do not need the purge as their starting point. The saga works best when it leaves the purge behind. Andor and the High Republic are proof that the franchise can thrive outside the gravitational pull of the purge. The question is whether it will choose to. Chapter 8: The Endless Loop. Examined from sufficient distance, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Order 66 was built as a full stop. The Jedi are gone. The Empire rises. The galaxy enters its darkest era. It was the ending that made the beginning of A New Hope possible, but Star Wars turned that ending into a beginning, and in doing so, created a storytelling trap from which it cannot escape. Lucas built the montage in Revenge of the Sith as a single unrepeatable blow. One viewing, one emotional impact, one wound that scars over and becomes part of the galaxy's foundation. The entire design assumed the audience would experience it once, absorb the devastation, and move forward into the original trilogy's story of hope, rising from the ashes. The franchise made a different choice. The Clone Wars showed Order 66 from Ahsoka and Rex's perspective. The Bad Batch showed it from Clone Force 99's perspective. Jedi Fallen Order showed it from Cal Kestis' perspective. Obi-Wan Kenobi showed it from Reva's perspective. The Mandalorian showed it from Grogu's perspective. Each of these tellings is well crafted. Each brings something new to the moment, but each one also asks the audience to re-experience the same fundamental tragedy, and with every new perspective, the impact distributes a little more thinly across the whole. The first time you see Order 66, it is a shock. The second time, it is anguish. The fifth time, it is familiar. The eighth time, it is expected. Not because the individual scenes are bad, they are often excellent, but because repetition inherently reduces the element of surprise and diminishes anticipation, and surprise is an essential component of what gives tragedy its full emotional force. Imagine if The Godfather had produced 8 spin-offs, each showing the Baptism Day murders from a different bodyguard's point of view. Each individual story might be compelling, but the cumulative effect would transform that iconic sequence from a singular cinematic event into a recurring setting. The audience would cease to be moved and begin merely to observe. They would recognize the shape of the tragedy before it began. Order 66 has undergone exactly that transformation. It is no longer a moment, it is a genre, and the more it is explored, the more it becomes domesticated. What was once the most shocking event in Star Wars has become, through sheer repetition, one of the most familiar. The audience no longer dreads Order 66, they expect it. They anticipate which characters will survive and how. They watch for the telltale signs. The clone troopers receiving a transmission, the shift in their body language, the moment a lightsaber is drawn too late. The surprise has been replaced by routine, and routine is the enemy of tragedy. This is what repetition does to storytelling, even excellent storytelling. It does not diminish the craft of any individual scene. The Order 66 sequence in the Clone Wars finale is still breathtaking. The Cal Kestis flashback in Jedi Fallen Order still lands. Each version, taken in isolation, works, but taken together, they form a pattern that the audience begins to see through. The emotional mechanism becomes visible, and once the audience can see the mechanism stops working the way it is supposed to. These are not separate problems. They are a single self-reinforcing dynamic. Each creative decision made in the wake of Order 66 constrained the next one. The chip demanded survivors who could be absolved. The survivors demanded hunters. The hunters demanded Vader's delegation. The delegation demanded a compressed timeline. And the compressed timeline demanded more stories set in the same narrow emotional corridor. The franchise did not make one mistake. It followed a single decision to its logical conclusion, and the conclusion was a trap. And it is a trap that feels safe from the inside, because returning to Order 66 guarantees emotional engagement. The audience already cares. The stakes are pre-established. The tragedy is proven. Why risk something unfamiliar when the purge is right there, waiting to be revisited from one more angle? None of this means Order 66 should never have happened. It is a masterful piece of storytelling within the context of Revenge of the Sith. The problem is not the event itself, it is the inability of Star Wars to move past it. The most interesting thing about Order 66 was never the moment of execution, it was the world it created. A galaxy without its ancient guardians, a galaxy where the Force is suppressed, feared, and forgotten. A galaxy where regular citizens have to find the courage to resist tyranny without a mystical order to protect them. That is the true promise of the Imperial era, and the stories that embrace that promise are the ones that resonate most deeply. The healthiest thing Star Wars could do with Order 66 is let it rest. Not forget it, not retcon it, just allow it to settle into the foundation where it belongs, load-bearing but unseen. The event that shaped the era without needing to be the centerpiece of every story set within it. The original trilogy never needed to show Order 66 on screen to make the audience feel its weight. The silence where the Jedi used to be was the impact. You felt it in every scene Obi-Wan appeared in, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. You felt it in Yoda's solitary exile on Dagobah. You felt it in Vader's mechanical breathing, each rasping cycle a reminder of what Anakin Skywalker had become. Some tragedies are most powerful when you let them stand on their own and stop explaining them. Ultimately, Order 66 stands as one of fiction's greatest ironies, a command meant to impose finality that instead ensured perpetual return. What was designed as a single, decisive act of narrative extinction becomes the gravitational center of an entire franchise, drawing creators and audiences back to the same wound again and again. Not because the moment failed, but because it succeeded too completely. The scale of the betrayal created not closure, but fixation, not silence, but echo. In trying to understand the Jedi once and for all, the story created an event too powerful to leave behind, and in revisiting it endlessly, Star Wars transformed annihilation into renewal. Order 66 was meant to close the book on the Jedi, but instead, it became the page the saga can never quite turn. If you want to understand the ancient order that Palpatine spent 1,000 years planning to destroy, watch Dawn of the Sith, the complete timeline of the ancient Sith. And if you want to see the entire saga from the other side of the lightsaber, the story of Star Wars from the perspective of the Sith tells the full story through the eyes of the dark side. Both are available on this channel right now.